The Baltic Sea does not scream. It swallows at 16 minutes past 9 on a January night in 1945. 3 explosions tear through a hole the length of 2 football fields, and for the next 62 minutes, thousands of voices do the screaming the sea won't. Survivors in lifeboats would remember it precisely. First a roar. Human
I
and
christened
enormous,
this ship in the
carrying
name of
across
the
black
people!
water, lit only by flares. Then, as the cold did its work, it thinned. Hundreds of voices. Then dozens. Then none. Just wind, ice, and a ship's lights sliding under the surface, like a candle pinched out by 2 fingers. 9,343. That's the low estimate. Some historians push it past 9,600. Whatever the true number, it's more than 6 times the death toll of the Titanic. On one ship in 1 hour, and if you stopped 100 people on the street and asked them to name it, 99 would have nothing to say. This is the deadliest shipwreck in human history, and the reason almost nobody's heard of it isn't an accident. It's a choice history quietly made for 70 years, about which corpses deserve remembering. Her name was the Wilhelm Gustloff. Before she was a coffin for 9,000 people, she was something almost obscenely cheerful. She launched in 1937. Flagship of a Nazi program called Strength Through Joy, selling German factory workers on the idea that fascism came with a Mediterranean cruise attached. 25,000 tons of steel, built to prove even a laborer could vacation like a gentleman. She was meant to carry Hitler's own name. Officials thought better of it, naming her instead for a minor Nazi organizer shot dead in his own doorway in Switzerland in 1936 by a Jewish medical student avenging the persecution of his people. A martyr's name, stitched onto a pleasure boat. The pleasure didn't last. War came, and the Gustloff became a hospital ship. Then, for 4 years, a floating barracks bolted to a pier in occupied Guinea, home to 2,000 U-boat trainees who never once took her to sea. Her engines sat cold. Half her lifeboats were quietly stripped for use elsewhere in the harbor. She had become furniture. Then, in January 1945, the Red Army stopped being a rumor. East Prussia, German soil for 700 years, began to collapse in days. Reports of what advancing Soviet troops were doing to German civilians moved faster than any official warning, and 2.5 million people ran for the coast. Berlin ordered the largest sea lift in history, throwing every hull that could float into a race west. On the morning of January 30th, the Wilhelm Gustloff was ordered back to sea. She was built for under 2,000 passengers. By nightfall, somewhere between 10 and 11,000 souls were wedged inside her. Soldiers, U-boat crewmen, 373 young women of the Naval Auxiliary bunked in the drained swimming pool. Wounded men on stretchers, and refugees, thousands of them. Many with no ticket and no name on any list. 4 captains stood on that bridge and agreed on almost nothing. 10 of her 22 lifeboats were already gone, scavenged for harbor duty. She left port anyway, with a single escort, the others assigned to her having already broken down. Around 6 that evening, the bridge received a message. A German minesweeper convoy was approaching in the dark. To avoid a collision, the captain switched on the ship's navigation lights. Nobody could ever confirm who sent that warning, or whether the convoy even existed. What's certain is that from that moment, the Wilhelm Gustloff was no longer invisible. 20-5 miles off the coast. A Soviet submarine called S-13 had been hunting for 19 days without a single kill. Her commander was Alexander Marinesko. And by January 1945, the Soviet Navy had already all but given up on him. Weeks earlier, he'd vanished on a multi-day bender in a Finnish port, drinking through leave with a woman nobody in his command approved of. A tribunal was already forming to try him. He sailed anyway on what was, in every sense that mattered to him, his last chance to be anything other than a disgrace in a uniform. For 19 days the Baltic gave him nothing. Then cruising the surface through snow flurries, his lookout saw lights. A ship, enormous, fully illuminated, running the coastline as if daring someone to notice it. Marinesko did something no textbook would recommend. Instead of diving to attack from open water, he steered his submarine into the shallows between the ship and the shore, the one direction her lookouts, trained on the open sea, would never think to check. It risked running his own boat aground. He didn't care. At under 1,000 meters, with Hitler's voice crackling from the target's loudspeakers, his final public radio address, marking 12 years since the Nazis seized power, Marinesko gave the order to fire. 4 torpedoes left the tubes of S-13, each hand-painted with a dedication before the patrol began. The first red for the motherland, the third for the Soviet people, the fourth for Leningrad, the city Marinesko's crew had watched starve under German siege. The second, the one that read for Stalin, jammed in its tube, armed and live, seconds from turning the hunters into the hunted. His men wrestled it into safety while 1,000 meters away. The other 3 found their target in under a minute. The first tore into the bow, sealing off crew quarters and drowning the very sailors trained to run the lifeboats. The second detonated in the swimming pool, where the Naval Auxiliary women slept. Of the 373, almost none survived the blast itself. The third ripped through the engine room. The lights died. The radios died. And the Wilhelm Gustloff, all 25,000 tons of her, began rolling onto her side in water just above freezing. What followed wasn't a rescue. It was an unraveling. 9 of her 22 lifeboats had frozen solid to their davits. Crewmen tore at the ice with bare, bleeding hands as the deck tilted further by the minute. One loaded boat dropped when its ice-locked mechanism gave, spilling its passengers onto the deck below. Corridors packed with families became death traps the moment anyone slipped, trampled by people who couldn't stop moving, even if they wanted to. Officers who saw no way out shot their own wives and children rather than let them drown, then turned the pistols on themselves. Mothers strapped adult-sized life jackets onto infants because there was nothing smaller. And in the water, those jackets rode up over small bodies and flipped the children face down. So the very thing meant to save them killed them instead. If a story like this is the kind of history you need to see with your own eyes, stay with me, it gets harder to watch before it's over. Tell me in the comments which city you're watching from tonight. 62 minutes after the first impact, the Wilhelm Gustloff went under bow first, dragging with her almost everyone still aboard. Her escort and a handful of other vessels pulled just over 1,000 survivors from the water and the ice floes. For weeks afterward, frozen bodies washed up along 50 miles of coastline. And nobody ever finished counting them, because nobody had finished counting who was on the ship in the first place. Marinesko sailed home believing he'd earned his redemption. He hadn't. Weeks later, he sank a second evacuation ship, killing thousands more, making him, by tonnage, the most successful Soviet submarine commander of the war. The Navy's answer was to deny him the Hero of the Soviet Union medal, judge him unfit to carry that title, and quietly push him out within the year. He drifted through the post-war Soviet Union, was later imprisoned in a labor camp on unrelated charges, and died in 1963 in near poverty, half forgotten by the country he'd sunk an empire's worth of refugees for. It took until 1990, 27 years after his death, for Gorbachev to grant him the title the Navy once decided he didn't deserve. Captain Peterson, the Gustloff's own master, never went to sea again. The officer who'd argued with him on the bridge was called before a tribunal to answer for the overcrowding, the lights, the missing lifeboats. But the Third Reich collapsed 3 months later, and no verdict was ever reached. Nobody was ever formally blamed for the worst maritime disaster in recorded history. For decades, almost nobody spoke of it. The dead were German civilians, killed by a Soviet torpedo. 3 months before the regime their country built collapsed under its own atrocities. And on a continent still burying the victims of the Holocaust, a ship full of drowned refugees didn't fit anywhere comfortably. So the story went quiet on both sides of the Iron Curtain. For 2 generations, here's what's left once the numbers stop being numbers. A submarine commander who sank more tonnage than any of his countrymen and was told he wasn't hero material. A ship named for a martyr, sailing on the anniversary of the movement that made him one. 373 women who never got the chance to fight back. Children drowned by the very jackets meant to keep them afloat. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. Marinesko fired on a ship carrying thousands of children, and it followed him into poverty and a labor camp anyway. Was he a war criminal, or a soldier doing exactly what years of Leningrad's dead demanded of him? And if the worst disaster in maritime history can vanish from memory this completely, what does that tell you about who gets remembered and who gets quietly erased? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if this is the kind of history nobody teaches you, subscribe, because there's more of it coming.